Tom Rodriguez had always considered himself more than just the owner of a successful auto repair shop. He was a steward of a tight-knit family. For 23 years, Rodriguez Auto Repair had been more than a business. It was his legacy, built on trust, sweat, and intuition. He could sense when Jimmy was fighting with his wife by the subtle twitch in his jaw while tightening lug nuts. He knew Sarah's eyes lit up when she worked on European cars, not because they were high-end, but because they reminded her of home, of her late father's garage in Hamburg. And then there was Mike Thompson. Mike wasn't just an employee. He was the cornerstone, the man who'd been there since day one, who'd helped turn 2 grease-stained service bays into the most reliable auto shop in Millbrook. So when Tom walked into his office that Tuesday morning and found a thin envelope resting neatly on his desk, something in his chest tightened instantly. He recognized Mike's handwriting instantly, steady, unpretentious, honest, just like the man himself. Tom's fingers trembled around his coffee mug as he stared at the envelope. It looked weightless, but it carried a heaviness he could already feel in his bones. Around him, the shop hummed with routine life. The pneumatic hiss of air tools, the rhythmic clinks of metal, the soft hum of the radio playing Springsteen. But inside that office, everything felt wrong. Time slowed. He opened the envelope, half hoping for a joke, a scribbled back in 5 note. But inside was a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. The note was surgical in its brevity. Tom, thank you for 23 years of steady work. I'm resigning, effective immediately. My tools are in the locker. Uniforms are in the bin. The Henderson's Buick needs brake pads. I ordered them. They'll arrive Thursday. I wish you and the shop all the best. Mike Thompson. Tom read it once, then twice. A third time. The words didn't settle. They stung. There was no warning, no warm farewell. Not even a phone call, just gone. Like a part of the shop had vanished overnight, and no one had noticed until now. Shoving back from his desk, heart racing, he stormed onto the garage floor. The clang and chaos of the shop swirled around him, Jimmy prying at a rusted wheel, Sarah hunched under a hood. But one bay stood cold and eerily still. Mike's. "Where's Mike?" Tom called, trying to sound calm but failing. Sarah poked her head up, grease smeared on her cheek. "Thought he was just running late." Tom held up the letter like it was evidence in a crime. "He's not late. He quit." Everything stopped. Even the radio seemed quieter. Jimmy's tire iron clanged to the ground. Sarah blinked in disbelief. "Quit," Jimmy echoed. "Mike doesn't quit. He's like the spirit of this place. He's been here longer than I've had a driver's license." Tom felt a hollow ache open wide in his chest. Mike had been more than dependable. He was the guy who took the tough jobs without complaint, who stayed late to handle the nightmare customers no one else could soothe. When Tom's wife left him 5 years ago, Mike hadn't said a word. He just stayed after hours, working in the next bay, offering quiet company when Tom couldn't face the silence. "I don't get it," Sarah whispered. "Yesterday, he was fine. We talked about his grandson's baseball game. He was excited." Tom drifted to Mike's bay, running a hand over the worn edge of the bench. The absence was visceral. The socket set Mike had built over years, gone. The torque wrench he'd calibrated to perfection, gone. Even the old coffee mug with the faded "Best Grandpa" print was missing. Only one thing remained. A photo tucked behind the air hose reel. Mike and his late wife, Helen, smiling at their 30th anniversary party. Tom had been there. He'd toasted Mike that night, calling him the most solid man he'd ever known. "Boss?" Jimmy's voice pulled him back. "What do we do?" Tom glanced around the shop. Sarah, the talented but relatively new tech. Jimmy, eager but green. Carlos, the part-timer with 1 foot still in high school. Without Mike, the team felt like a classic engine missing a vital cylinder. "We keep working," Tom said, though the words rang hollow. "We've got customers counting on us." But as the day wore on, the cracks widened. The Hendersons called, looking for Mike. Tom tried to explain, but couldn't hide the strain in his voice. Later, Mrs. Peterson rolled in with her aging Camry, the one Mike had kept alive with grit and miracles. She peered toward Mike's bay, now silent, and her face fell. "Where's Mike?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's no longer with us," Tom replied, each word burning like broken glass in his throat. By the time the garage doors clanged shut that evening, Tom felt wrung out, his thoughts in disarray. He sat in his office, staring at Mike's letter, as if willing it to explain itself. But it didn't. The shop, once a place of laughter and trust, now felt dimmer, quieter, like it was holding its breath. A knock at the door. Sarah stepped in, fidgeting. "Tom, can I talk to you?" "Of course." He motioned to the seat opposite his desk. She sat, looking uneasy. "I've been thinking about yesterday. Mike, he seemed different. Not bad, just distant. I asked if he was okay. He just said he was tired." "Tired how?" "Not like sleepy tired. Like emotionally tired. Like he was carrying something invisible." Tom leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Tired. The word echoed. Not from work, but from something deeper. Something maybe none of them had seen, or maybe they had, but didn't want to admit. And just like that, a new question settled heavy on Tom's heart. Not why Mike left, but what kind of weight he had been shouldering all alone. That was the part that unsettled Tom the most. Mike never complained. Not once in over 2 decades. Not during late-night overtime. Not when the winter chills seeped through the garage doors. Not even when personal loss hit him hard. But Sarah's sudden pause, her hesitance, lit up Tom's internal warning system. Refined from years of decoding engine ticks and misfires, no diagnostic tool could detect. "What about Dan?" he asked quietly, gently encouraging. Sarah hesitated, cheeks coloring. "It's probably nothing. Just sometimes Dan's a bit rough with the older guys, always pushing efficiency, always talking about how things need to be modernized." She bit her lip, but Mike never seemed to let it get to him. Dan Martinez, Tom's shop manager, hired 3 years ago when paperwork began piling higher than engine blocks. On paper, Dan was gold, college-educated, process-oriented, and ruthlessly efficient. He'd tightened their scheduling, negotiated better supplier deals, and introduced new software that reduced invoicing errors by 80%. But beneath that polished surface, Tom had never really examined how Dan operated on the shop floor. "What kind of comments?" Tom asked. Sarah looked away. "Maybe you should ask Dan. I don't want to start something." That night, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the shop sat cloaked in silence, Tom stayed in his office longer than usual. He didn't touch his paperwork. He just stared out at the shadows stretching across the garage bays. Mike's absence felt like a hollow echo, bouncing off the concrete walls. He remembered Mike's quiet presence, his intuitive problem-solving, the calm way he guided younger techs without ever making them feel small. In 23 years, Mike had never once called out sick, never once failed to deliver. So why would he just walk away without a word? Tom reached for his phone and called Mike, straight to voicemail. An hour later, he called again. Still nothing. On his way home, he drove past Mike's house. No lights, no truck. Just silence. And in that silence, Tom realized something far heavier than disappointment. He had missed something. Something serious. That night, sleep evaded him. The resignation letter lay on his nightstand like a riddle etched in grief. He stared at the ceiling, heart racing, mind churning. Over and over, he saw Mike's empty workstation, the confused faces of loyal customers, the shame in not having answers. Something had driven Mike away, something deeper than burnout or age. And Tom was going to find out what. Because Mike Thompson didn't just leave. He'd endured too much, invested too deeply. There had to be a reason, and Tom had to face the possibility that he might have played a part in it. 3 restless nights later, clarity struck. It came in the dark hours, when doubt whispered loudest. Tom would go undercover in his own shop. It sounded crazy, insane even. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd spent the last few years behind a desk, buried in bills, service orders, and insurance claims. The moments he'd ventured out onto the floor were met with polite smiles, quick posture corrections. He wasn't seeing the truth. He was seeing the performance. But what if the boss disappeared? What if he came back as just another guy with calloused hands and a hopeful heart? Tom picked up the phone and dialed his cousin Eddie, who owned a small garage a few towns over. "I need a favor," Tom said flatly. "And you're probably going to think I've lost it." He explained the plan, the disguise, the backstory. Eddie paused for a beat, then exhaled. "You want to spy on your own team? I want to understand what happened to Mike," Tom said. "I won't get that from behind this desk. People tell the boss what he wants to hear, but no one filters their words around the new guy." "And your alias?" "Tommy Ramirez," Tom replied, using his middle name and his ex-wife's maiden name. "New in town, some garage experience but needs training." Eddie sighed. "You're out of your mind, but if anyone can pull this off, it's you. I'll vouch for you if anyone calls." "Thanks, and Eddie. I need to know. I can't lose another person like Mike." "Be careful," Eddie said. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than the questions." Monday morning arrived with a storm of nerves. Tom Rodriguez stayed home with a fake family emergency, but Tommy Ramirez showed up at the shop door, looking like a man worn down by circumstance. He'd grown out his beard, reshaped his hair, and swapped his clean-cut polo for faded jeans and a plain tee. A baseball cap sat low over his eyes. He looked nothing like the shop owner, just another mechanic hoping for a break. Dan Martinez was at the front desk, phone in hand. He glanced up, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Help you?" he asked flatly. "I heard you might be hiring," Tom said, softening his voice to sound unsure, almost shy. "I'm Tommy Ramirez. Got a bit of car experience, really need the work." Dan scanned him quickly. "Experience doing what?" "Mostly oil changes at Jiffy Lube," Tom lied, biting back the urge to challenge Dan's dismissive tone. "I've worked on my own cars, helped friends. I'm willing to learn. I'll start at minimum wage. Just give me a shot." Dan leaned back, crossing his arms. "We don't usually hire walk-ins, and with Rodriguez out for a while, I'm not making any hiring calls." Tom pressed. "I heard you lost someone, one of your guys. Maybe I could help out." Dan's jaw tensed. Something flickered in his eyes. A shadow. "Yeah," he said, voice clipped. "Mike Thompson. He left." Something in the way Dan said it, the cold detachment, the lack of respect, told Tom everything he needed to know. The truth was waiting, buried under layers of pride, routine, and silence. And Tom was ready to dig. "Couldn't handle the pressure," Dan said with a smirk, not even looking up from his watch. "These older guys, they just get too stuck in their ways, can't keep up with modern expectations." Tom felt his jaw tense. Every part of him wanted to fire back, to remind Dan that Mike Thompson had carried this shop on his back through brutal winters, economic downturns, and more busted engines than anyone could count. But he swallowed the urge. Tommy Ramirez wouldn't know that. "So, you're looking for someone who can adapt?" he asked instead, voice calm. Dan shrugged. "Look, I've got real work to do. Come back when Rodriguez is around, if you want to waste his time." But before Tom could respond, a voice rang out from the shop floor. Sarah, wiping grease from her hands, stepped into view. "Dan," she said firmly, "we really could use the help. Jimmy's buried with the Morrison job, and I've got 2 diagnostics lined up behind him." Dan narrowed his eyes. "Sarah, this isn't your call." "I know," she replied, her voice even but unyielding. "But we're 3 jobs behind." What's the harm in letting him help for a few days? See how he works." Tom's eyes narrowed as he watched Sarah. She was standing taller than usual. He'd always known her as quiet, deferential. But now she was drawing a line. Something had shifted in her. Dan, clearly annoyed, finally gave in. "Fine, but he's your responsibility. No overtime, 8 hours, not a minute more." Tom nodded, keeping his tone measured. "Thanks. I appreciate the chance." As Dan walked off, Sarah turned to Tom and offered a quiet smile. "Don't mind him. He's been extra cranky since Mike left. I'm Sarah, by the way." "Tommy," he said, offering a hand. "Thanks for sticking up for me." "We're a team here," she said. "At least, most of us." She cast a quick glance toward Dan's retreating back before leading Tom deeper into the garage. And for the first time in years, Tom saw the shop not from the elevated view of ownership, but from the ground floor, grimy, noisy, and under strain. The space felt tighter. The noise of impact wrenches and drop tools rang louder. And most of all, there was tension, a kind of nervous energy humming beneath the surface. Sarah pointed toward a younger mechanic hunched over a stubborn transmission. "That's Jimmy. He's good, eager, but ever since Mike left, he's been off. Mike was like a second father to him." Tom tucked that away. Already the cracks were showing. Fissures invisible from his office window, but wide open down here. "What was Mike like?" he asked gently. Sarah's face softened, her shoulders dropping as if the question released something heavy. "He was the best, patient, kind. The kind of guy who didn't just teach you how to fix things, he taught you why things worked. Losing him was like the heart of the shop just stopped beating." "Do you know why he left?" She hesitated. "He left a note. That's all we know. But," she glanced around, lowering her voice, "I think there's more to it." As the day wore on, Tom began to see what she meant. Dan's presence was like cold air, sharp, suffocating. The crew jumped when he entered a room. Conversations stalled. Smiles vanished. It wasn't a team under pressure. It was a team under siege. Whatever had pushed Mike out, it wasn't just long hours or age. It was the atmosphere itself. By his third day as Tommy Ramirez, Tom had melted into the background. He swept, fetched tools, and helped where he could. But more than anything, he listened. During lunch break, he sat with Jimmy behind the building. They ate sandwiches on overturned crates, watching traffic meander down Main Street. "Could have used that bonus last month," Jimmy muttered between bites. "My kid needed new school clothes, had to put it on the card again." Tom froze. "Bonus?" Jimmy looked at him like he was from another planet. "Yeah, the quarterly bonuses. We're supposed to get one every 3 months if the shop hits its targets." Tom kept his tone neutral. "Haven't gotten one lately. Not in nearly a year. Dan says we keep missing the numbers." He crumpled the sandwich wrapper. "But we've been busier than ever. None of it adds up." Later, Tom helped Sarah organize parts inventory. As they worked, he brought it up again. Jimmy mentioned bonuses. Sarah paused, eyes flickering to the door before she stepped closer. "Can I trust you?" she asked. "Yeah," he said without hesitation. "We used to get bonuses. $300–400 each, enough to matter. They stopped about 10 months ago. Dan always has a reason, says the owner's cutting back or the numbers are bad." Tom felt like the walls were closing in. "What does Rodriguez say?" She looked down. "We never see him anymore. Dan says he's too busy, but Mike didn't buy it." Her voice trembled. 6 months ago, Mike asked about the bonuses. Dan told him to drop it, said it was inappropriate to ask about money. That night, Tom stayed late. When the shop emptied, he used his key to access the office. Fingers trembling, he opened the payroll system. The bonus budget was there, every quarter, $4,000, allocated, approved. But the payouts? Redirected. He dug deeper. The money had been siphoned into an account labeled operational expenses, equipment maintenance. Only the actual maintenance records didn't match. Tom's gut twisted as he printed the reports. $16,000, stolen from the very people who kept his business alive. The next day, Tommy Ramirez came to work with new eyes. Dan's watch, his new jacket, his stories about fine dining and weekend trips. At break, Tom overheard Carlos speaking to Jimmy in Spanish. Dan said if I complain about hours again, he'll replace me. He said the same thing to Mike, Jimmy replied. Right after Mike asked about overtime from the Patterson Fleet job, Dan lost it. Tom's breath caught. Mike had worked 60 hours that week. Tom had approved overtime for the whole crew, but if that money vanished too. Later, Sarah mentioned that Dan now insisted on submitting timesheets himself. Mechanics didn't even see their hours before payday. Jimmy said his paychecks had started shrinking. Hours shaved without explanation. The pattern was no longer just unethical. It was criminal. Tom Rodriguez had come undercover searching for a reason. Now he had a reckoning. Carlos had barely finished his sentence about working through lunch breaks without compensation when the full picture finally clicked into place. A cold truth crystallized in Tom's mind. Dan hadn't just been inefficient or abrasive. He had been orchestrating a calculated, methodical theft from the very people who made Rodriguez Auto Repair run. He wasn't cutting corners. He was carving out the heart of the business for his own gain. And when Mike, of all people, steady, loyal, principled Mike, began to ask questions, Dan hadn't corrected his behavior or come clean. He'd threatened him. Tom thought back to the resignation letter, so sterile, so heartbreakingly formal. It wasn't just a man walking away from a job. It was a man with unshakable integrity being forced out of the place he'd helped build. Mike didn't quit to save himself. He left to protect the others. Because he knew if he stayed and spoke louder, Dan would find a way to hurt more than just his pride. That night, Tom sat alone in his truck just across the street from the shop. The building looked the same, brightly lit signs, the faded mural on the garage door, the smell of oil that clung to the air. But something inside had rotted. He'd built this business on a promise. To be fair, to be the kind of boss his father had never had. But while he'd been buried in vendor meetings and payroll audits, Dan had been dismantling that dream from within. The most painful part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was knowing that Mike had tried to do the right thing, and Tom hadn't been there to back him up. He hadn't seen it, hadn't asked, hadn't known. He stared down at his phone, thumb hovering over Mike's number. His gut screamed to call, to apologize. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not without the full truth. He owed Mike more than regret. He owed him justice. In the pre-dawn quiet of the following morning, Tom sat in his darkened office, the blue glow of the monitor illuminating his pale, drawn face. The numbers on the screen confirmed what his gut had already told him. Dan's corruption was deeper than anyone could have guessed. It wasn't just the bonus money. It was a web of deceit stretching across the last 10 months. Dan had fabricated vendor accounts, generated fake invoices for parts that were never ordered, for repairs that never happened. The funds flowed into what looked like legitimate accounts, only they all funneled back into a single bank account, registered under the name Daniel Martinez. The thefts weren't impulsive. They were escalating. He'd started small, $300 here, $500 there. But as he realized Tom wasn't paying attention, he grew bolder. Over $30,000 had disappeared, money that should have gone to overtime, bonuses, and even the petty cash fund Tom had earmarked for holiday parties and employee lunches. Tom's cousin Eddie texted just then, "How's the undercover thing going?" Tom stared at the blinking cursor before replying, "Worse than I thought. He's been stealing, from everyone." And then came the memory of Mike again. How tired he'd looked those final weeks, how quiet. Sarah had called it soul-tired. Now Tom understood. Mike wasn't burned out. He'd been drowning, fighting for something bigger than himself, trying to save a sinking ship while everyone else was still dancing on the deck. The door chimed behind Tom. He shut down the computer and peeked through the blinds. Dan. Casual, confident, strolling through the garage like he owned it. No remorse, no fear. Just that same smug air of superiority. Tom quietly slipped out the back and circled to the front, slipping into the role of Tommy again. "You're early," Dan muttered, eyes on his clipboard. "Needed the hours," Tom replied. And he wasn't lying. As the day wore on, Tom watched Dan more closely than ever. The manipulation was subtle, precise. He'd praise Sarah while casting doubt on her instincts, joke with Jimmy about his mistakes in a way that disguised criticism as camaraderie. When Carlos raised concerns about safety equipment, Dan brushed him off like a child complaining about the weather. But the worst came during the morning break. "You know," Dan said loudly, voice coated with artificial concern, "maybe it's for the best that Mike's gone. The guy was getting too set in his ways. Sometimes dead weight needs to go." Tom felt a burn rise in his throat, but he held it down. Sarah turned sharply, her voice trembling. "Mike wasn't dead weight. He carried this place." Dan gave a condescending smile. "From where I stood, he questioned every call I made. Undermined me. Made people think they deserved special treatment." "Special treatment?" Jimmy snapped. "You mean like those bonuses we earned?" Dan's eyes narrowed. Bonuses are earned through performance. Mike thought tenure meant entitlement. Tom's knuckles turned white around the wrench in his hand. These weren't just lies. They were character assassinations. He could see it in his team's faces. The weariness, the doubt, the erosion of morale. They had believed in something once, and Dan had poisoned it. Later that afternoon, while organizing old invoices, Tom found what he didn't know he was looking for, an old folder shoved behind a cabinet labeled Personnel Issues. Inside were notes, handwritten. Dan's precise script, like a surgeon carving up reputations. Every interaction with each employee. Comments about attitudes, performance, punctuality. But Mike's section was the most detailed. Dozens of entries. Times Mike had questioned missing overtime, asked about bonuses, expressed concern over low morale. But Dan had spun each one as insubordination, disruptive behavior, resistance to progress. Dan had even documented the day Mike threatened to escalate the issue. The final entry read, reminded Thompson of at-will employment, warned that baseless accusations against management could result in termination and unfavorable references, suggested discretion moving forward. The next day, Mike was gone. Tom stared at the paper, his vision blurring. Dan hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen trust. He had stolen a man's dignity, and now he was going to answer for it. Dan hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen the soul of Rodriguez Auto Repair, transforming it from a place built on trust into a quiet battlefield where loyalty was punished and integrity was treated like insubordination. He had driven out the shop's heart, Mike Thompson, and in doing so, fractured the very spirit that had made the garage more than just a business. But the most devastating truth of all, Tom had let it happen. While he'd buried himself in the numbers, in expansion plans and vendor meetings, he'd trusted Dan to protect the culture that mattered most. He'd believed Dan when he talked about efficiency and optimization, never suspecting the cost was paid in silence and stolen hours. Sitting in his office surrounded by a mountain of evidence, false invoices, ghost vendors, rerouted bonuses, Tom knew that firing Dan wouldn't be enough. He had to make this right. Not just for himself, but for every employee who had shown up day after day believing they were part of something honorable. So on that Friday morning, Tom didn't show up in disguise. He walked through the front door as the man who owned the place. Clean-shaven, his hair combed back, wearing the shop's branded polo with quiet pride. Tom Rodriguez stepped into his kingdom with fire in his chest and justice in his hands. Dan was behind the counter, phone in hand, playing boss like nothing had changed. When he looked up and saw Tom, there was a flicker of confusion, quickly masked by a fake smile. "Rodriguez, thought you were still tied up with that family thing. Everything good?" Tom didn't smile back. We need to talk. In my office. Something in Tom's tone sliced through Dan's facade. The false ease dropped from his face as he followed Tom in silence. Once inside, Tom shut the door with deliberate finality and motioned toward the chair. Dan sat slowly, eyes flicking to the thick folder on the desk, pages spilling out like evidence in a trial. "I've been doing some digging," Tom began, voice like frost, "into payroll, vendor accounts, employee morale." Dan tried to fake nonchalance. "Oh, find anything interesting?" "Very." Tom opened the folder. Page after page laid bare on the desk. "Let's talk about the equipment maintenance account." Dan's color drained. What do you mean?" Tom's voice remained deadly calm. "The one where you rerouted the quarterly bonuses. $16,000, meant for Sarah, Jimmy, Carlos, and Mike. Gone." Dan floundered. "I can explain." "Can you explain these vendors that don't exist? This bank account in your name, the deleted overtime hours, the altered commissions?" Dan stammered. "It's not what it looks like." Tom slammed his hand on the desk. "Then what is it, Dan? Because from where I'm standing, it's theft. From the people who make this shop what it is." Dan sagged in his chair, sweat on his brow. "We were struggling. I needed to cut costs." Tom stood. "We've been up 30% in profits. You didn't cut costs. You lined your pockets." Tom pulled another document from the folder and tossed it onto the desk. "Your notes about Mike, the man who spent 23 years keeping this place afloat. You documented every concern he raised. You framed him as a problem when he was trying to protect this team from you." Dan's voice cracked. "Mike was undermining me. He was trying to save this place." Tom's voice surged, the pain finally breaking through. "When my wife left, Mike stayed late, just to make sure I wasn't alone. When Jimmy had his first kid, Mike showed him how to baby-proof a car seat. He trained Sarah, mentored Carlos, and never asked for a thing." Dan reached for his wallet. "I can pay some back." Tom recoiled. "This isn't about a few $100 in hush money. You stole $30,000 from people who barely scrape by, from Christmas bonuses, from emergency pay, from the soul of this shop." Dan's composure shattered. "What do you want me to do?" Tom's voice was low and final. "Leave. You're fired, effective immediately. I filed everything. Police report goes in Monday morning." Dan begged. "Please, just give me a chance." "You had 10 months of chances," Tom snapped. "And when Mike tried to stop you, you threatened him with blacklisting. He didn't walk away. You drove him out." Tom handed Dan an envelope. "Your final paycheck. Cameras recorded this conversation. If you show your face here again, you'll be escorted out by law enforcement." Dan took the envelope with trembling hands. At the door, Tom called out once more. "Dan!" Dan turned, eyes wet with false hope. "Mike Thompson is twice the man you'll ever be." Then he was gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was cleansing. But Tom knew this was just the beginning. Justice had been served. Now came the restoration. He stared at his phone, heart pounding, and dialed the number that mattered most. After several rings, Mike answered, rough, guarded, tired. "Hello?" "Mike, it's Tom." A pause. "Thought you had a family emergency." "That was a cover. I went undercover. I saw what happened. I saw what you were up against, and I failed you." Another pause. "I'm listening." Tom told him everything. Dan's crimes, the stolen bonuses, the intimidation, the betrayal. When he finished, the line went quiet. "You went undercover in your own shop?" "I had to know. I had to understand why you left." Mike exhaled, long and slow. "It was eating me alive, Tom, watching people I care about get robbed while I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it." "You tried, Mike, and you shouldn't have had to do it alone." Tom's voice cracked. "I want you back, as lead mechanic, full management rights, a say in every decision." Mike was quiet. "I don't know if I can come back. Too much damage." Tom's voice softened. "Then help me build something better, not just fix the damage, prevent it. No more blind trust, no more secrets." That afternoon, Tom called a meeting. Standing before Sarah, Jimmy, and Carlos, He laid it all bare. The stolen money, Dan's deception, Mike's bravery. They wept, they raged, but most of all, they began to heal. Checks were cut, every penny returned, plus interest. Timesheets went transparent, paychecks became collaborative, not hidden. And then, on a bright Thursday morning, Mike walked through the door, tool bag in hand. "I heard there's an opening," he said, smiling faintly. Tom stood, eyes full. Lead mechanic, 20% raise, management voice, and no more silence. Mike extended his hand. "Let's build it the right way." They shook, and from the far side of the garage, laughter echoed, not forced or hollow, but real. Rodriguez Auto Repair was alive again. Not just fixed, but reborn. The mechanic's resignation had been a mystery. But now, it was a turning point, a catalyst for truth, and a reminder that loyalty, once honored, could rebuild even the most broken of places.